What are the limits of augmented reality? When I started in the industry, like lots of us, we wanted to know what they were because we wanted to break them. The first application that I showed at AWE in 2011 was a human anatomy app for AR, where you could see a life-size body in AR, peel back the layers, look inside, see how the organs worked, how the connective tissue connected to the bones. We spent months and months dedicated to pushing the limits of the technology so that you could have a seamless experience in this large format. It was 9 years ago. We didn't have the tools that we had today. And we learned so much about how the technology could help people to learn faster. But it was that same year that I saw this for the first time, and it's perhaps one of my favorite examples of augmented reality. And it was a wake-up call for me, because it showed that it wasn't the fancy technology that made for an amazing experience. In fact, you didn't need technology at all. And it's a constant reminder to me today that the technology usually doesn't matter. And it was then that my colleagues and I realized we had to develop a new set of principles to help us work in this new medium. And as designers often do, we turn to pop culture because it's cool, because it was exciting to see that a lot of people would see a reference design and they'd become familiar and it could create expectations. But one of the principles that we learned first was that just because something looks really cool on a big screen doesn't mean that it'll look good in real life. In fact, if anyone's ever heard a little bit about cognitive load, you'll know that anyone looking at an interface like that no longer has the ability to make a decision. And so if pop culture wasn't necessarily the right place to look, we started to look back. And a lot of people have probably seen what people like Ivan Sutherland did as far back as the 1960s. Well, one of my favorite examples was actually something that Henry Dreyfuss published in the 1950s. And this was a human factors study on just about every type of human factors you could imagine. Like if you wanted to know how far to space the buttons on your airplane joystick to make it comfortable, you could find it here. If you wanted to know how small of a tunnel you could pull yourself through on your back, you could find it here. If you wanted to know at what angle it was comfortable to look down at content, or how high your eyes could move up before you had to move your neck and cause neck strain. No, wait a minute, this was actually something that we did want to know. And it was fascinating, because back then they didn't have the technology to overcome the problems, but they were looking at the impact on the people. And there was a lot that we could learn from this. And it reminded me of a really important quote about architecture. When an architect makes a building, people have to live with the choices that they make. And what we're doing today will result in choices that a lot of people will have to live with for a long time. Think about the placement of a step in a building. You put it in the wrong place, and eventually somebody's going to trip and hurt themselves. But on the flip side, if you put steps in the right place and you add some extra steps, you can actually make people more active, and you can have them have a better living experience using that building. It was clear to us that we were working with a really powerful medium, and that we had a responsibility to get things right. One other example was gestures. Everybody thought that we would use gestures to input in AR, and one of the things that we learned was that if you ask somebody to work with their hands above waist level for any period of time, you can introduce repetitive strain like carpal tunnel in the shoulder. So one of the things that we need to think about is, what are our choices going to mean to people in the future? Now, it's not just about what shouldn't we do. In fact, we learned that aside from some of these human factors, a lot of these limits were really contrived. They were about the devices that we were working on. A lot of times we found ourselves designing around the eccentricities of a specific device instead of creating the best experience possible. And that was something we didn't want to do. When you design for a device, you're often designing to showcase its strengths or to hide its weaknesses. And what we came to was our first principle that we should always start as if there was nothing between the user and the experience. And now, after developing that first principle, we made this next app, and this is still one of my favorites because it's human-centric. It's holding in your hand chemistry. Sure, you could read a book, but you can hold the elements and interact with them. And this was really powerful. It just showed that you could have an experience in AR that you couldn't have somewhere else. And through this, I began to realize just how malleable our medium was. And if everything was malleable, like, what does that say about limits? And what are limits anyway? I mean, all of us are exposed to limits in our daily life, but do we ever stop and ask, what is a limit? Don't color outside of the lines. You have to be tall to play basketball. These toys, those are for boys. We're programmed to accept limits a little bit too easily. Even seemingly benign ones can lead to more malignant ones. You're not smart enough. Your people don't belong here. But limits are not real. We can define them in many ways, and that could be part of the problem. But to me, limits are things that hold people back, things perceived as absolutes, boundaries you can't go across, but they're not real. Speed limit is a great example because it's absolutely not a limit in the sense that if I'm going 55 miles per hour, I could just step on the gas. Magic. It may be a good idea. It may be safe to drive at a speed limit. There may be consequences if I decide to exceed it, but it's not an absolute. You might say the engine can only go so fast, you can put another engine in it. This is just a constraint. We cage ourselves in, when in reality, there's no limits that we can't break. There should be no limits that hold us back. So what actually does hold us back? What prevents us from making a change? What stops us from taking the leap and doing something differently? It's fear. What we call limits are actually a normalization of the fears that hold us back. And it's obvious when it's a dictator using fear to control the population, but it's a lot less obvious when it's ourselves, because it builds up over time. Do as you're told. Fall in line. Conform. It makes us afraid of what we can do, afraid of failure or embarrassment. All of these fears add up, and they hold us back, and they make us decide what we can and cannot do. But imagine a world where we're not held back by these fears. Imagine what we could accomplish. But how do we overcome something that's so ingrained in our minds that we've stopped recognizing that it's there? And I believe that part of the solution is in augmented reality itself. And of all the audiences in the world, this is the one that knows that AR is not just about catching monsters on your phone. AR lets you see things that you couldn't see before, and it lets you share ideas in a whole new way. And these two things create a bridge between reality and abstract ideas that's never existed before. A way that lets you boil down knowledge for absorption instead of information for consumption. Because you can see it in your world, you're able to understand it in a more complete way. You don't have to start learning over. You can transfer knowledge. We get from the physical world the ability to apply pattern matching and intuition to problems and things. And with AR, we can take ideas from the virtual, from abstraction, and make the knowledge formatted for the real world and to take advantage of that. Now, this isn't just anecdotal. We've seen the effects of this in study after study. Augmented reality consistently shows that people can learn more quickly, put it to work with less errors than any technology that's been available before. And you may have heard of a study that Daiquiri and Siemens did where they used AR to teach workers to build part of a gas turbine power plant. And what we saw was profound. In just one operation, it required 8 hours of classroom time and on average 450 minutes to complete the task. But with augmented reality, we're able to remove the classroom time entirely and get right to work. And the average worker with augmented reality was able to complete it in less than 50 minutes. 50 minutes. Not only did they learn faster, they performed the task with less errors. And the workers told the researchers that they felt safer because of it. What could you do with 90% of your time back in a shift over the day, a year? What could we do as a society if we had 90% of the time in every century? It's the ability to share ideas with less friction, to execute without errors, and an understanding that having knowledge when you need it removes fear. Now, about this time in my life, I was also navigating something that was entirely new and scary. My second son was born, and this is Valentine. He's an amazing boy. He's brilliant, he's curious, he's caring. And one of the hardest moments in my life was when Valentine was diagnosed with cerebral palsy. He was born with a condition called spastic diplegia. And if you've ever had a muscle spasm in your leg, you know a little bit about what that's like. Because every moment that he was awake, every muscle in his legs would spasm like that. And because of that, the noise in his spinal cord, he couldn't walk and he couldn't talk. And his mother and I, we searched for treatment options, and we were lucky enough to be connected with the best pediatric neurology department at the best hospital in the world. And we waited months for an appointment. And in 15 minutes, we were told that as cerebral palsy goes, it's not that bad. We should feel lucky. He'll never walk. There's nothing that we can do. And one of the greatest regrets of my life is that when I walked out that door, I was so afraid that I almost accepted that limit. And my wife and my son reminded me how wrong I was and that limits are not real. And we met a doctor at St. Louis Children's Hospital who was performing a transformative surgery. My son was going to have spinal surgery. They would cut open his spine, and they would find the nerves that were damaged. They would cut them. And it was a success. And he's learning to walk now. And he can even tell you all about it. But then I learned that this surgery had been being performed for over 20 years. And the best pediatric neurology department at one of the best hospitals in the world didn't know about a transformative procedure in their own specialty. And it's not their fault. They dedicate their lives to helping people. The problem was that the knowledge just wasn't flowing. If they knew, of course they would tell us. That's terrifying. I know the effect that had on me. And of course, I wanted to see what could we do, what could be done, how could I understand this? Is there something that my specialty of augmented reality could do to affect what happens in surgery. And what I learned was mind-blowing. It's nearly a it's over $2 trillion industry, but it's available to less than 1/3 of the people on the planet. It's over 5 billion people on the planet that don't have access to surgery, even basic surgery. And if you need something as simple as having your appendix removed, you die. You die. It's the leading cause of preventable death in the world, not having access to basic surgery. And I know that it might be a little bit of a controversy to say, could AR make the best surgeon better? But we don't have to ask that question. We know that it can teach a new surgeon something. It can teach a new procedure to an experienced surgeon. I would argue that yes, you could make the best surgeon better, but we don't even have to ask that question. And once we're doing any type of procedures with AR, we can start to share that information. We can start to transfer that knowledge at scale. And this isn't just about one industry. This is about transforming all industries. Have you ever struggled or watched somebody struggle to learn something new? I mean, ultimately, it's that struggle that stops people from learning at all. I can't learn that. I'm not smart enough. These are all limits. Limits that grow to a societal level where people just accept that they're not able to do something. They'll never be able to be somebody. If we could change the way that people think about learning itself, that would have a dramatic impact on knowledge and learning at a societal level. I'll tell you one last story that gives me a lot of hope that we can have that impact. 2 years ago, I met James Robinson, the head of development for the Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians. And when he saw AR for the first time, he was really excited about how it could transform the lives of his people. He has a tribe of over 10,000 members, and over half of them are 21 or under. And even though there's jobs on tribal lands and in neighboring communities, they don't have access because they don't have the skills. And I remember when we were talking about it, one of the things that stood out was he didn't want someone to come in and just do this for the tribe. He wanted the members of the tribe to learn how to create the work instructions in AR. And he wanted it so that anything that they created, they could share with other tribes. And so this is Kobe, and over the course of a week, he and his classmates learned to program augmented reality work instructions. And that's James there learning how to do electrical maintenance with an augmented reality work instruction created by Kobe during that class. This is just the beginning. It's a small step in the right direction. But if this industry is building tools that can help a community to redefine what's possible for them, that's a world that I want to live in. If someday anyone can put on a device and know how to do any job, have the ability that in that moment to learn what they want to learn, they can think about limits in a whole different way. And with a tool like augmented reality, with the ability to learn, we can all ask ourselves, is this really a limit? Should this hold me back? Because I think the only limitations that can really hold us back are the ones that we're willing to accept. Thank you.